Hello everyone! Welcome to Literature Revision with Mr. Johnston. Today, we're going to be looking at an extract from Chapter 5, Jekyll's Abandoned Laboratory. This video is going to answer the following questions. Why does Jekyll suddenly become sick in this chapter? How is this extract inspired by the Gothic genre? And how does Stevenson withhold information from the reader? Before we begin, you may be interested in downloading my free resource for this extract. Click a link in the description box below this video to download this resource for free. It comes complete with writing tables for taking notes, short writing tasks, and exemplar paragraphs. Let's now summarize our extract. In the last chapter, Hyde killed Sir Danvers Carew. Utterson and the police inspector travelled to Soho to arrest Hyde, but he was nowhere to be seen. Utterson is now very worried for Jekyll's safety. He knows that Jekyll is associating with a crazed murderer, Mr. Hyde. Utterson is worried that Jekyll will be Hyde's next victim. Utterson now travels to Jekyll's house to guarantee his friend's safety. Utterson enters Jekyll's property through the front door. He then travels across the yard to Jekyll's laboratory. Now this laboratory looks gloomy and deserted. It is clear that Jekyll has abandoned his experiments. Utterson walks through the laboratory to Jekyll's cabinet, which is here. Jekyll's cabinet is a small room connected to the laboratory through a flight of stairs. This is where Utterson finds Jekyll. Jekyll looks deadly sick. After Carew's murder, he is very nervous and anxious. Jekyll is sick because of his guilt over Carew's murder, but Stevenson does not reveal this until chapter 10. Jekyll reassures Utterson that he is not protecting Hyde. He also claims that he will never see Hyde again. Let's now read the extract itself. To skip the reading of this extract, jump to 5 minutes 26 seconds. It was late in the afternoon when Mr. Utterson found his way to Dr. Jekyll's door, where he was at once admitted by Poole, and carried down by the kitchen offices and across a yard which had once been a garden, to the buildings which was indifferently known as the laboratory or the dissecting rooms. The doctor had bought the house from the heirs of a celebrated surgeon, and his own tastes, being rather chemical than anatomical, had changed the destination of a block at the bottom of the garden. It was the first time that the lawyer had been received in that part of his friend's quarters, and he eyed the dingy, windowless structure with curiosity, and gazed round with a distasteful sense of strangeness as he crossed the theatre, once crowded with eager students, and now lying gaunt and silent, the tables laden with chemical apparatus, the floor strewn with crates and littered with packing straw, and the light falling dimly through the foggy cupola. At the further end, a flight of stairs mounted to a door, covered with red baize, and through this, Mr. Utterson was at last received into the doctor's cabinet. It was a large room, fitted round with glass presses, furnished, among other things, with a cheval glass and a business table, and looking out upon the court by 3 dusty windows, barred with iron. A fire burned in the grate. A lamp was set lighted on the chimney shelf, for even in the houses the fog began to lie thickly, and there, close up to the warmth, sat Dr. Jekyll, looking deadly sick. He did not rise to meet his visitor, but held out a cold hand and bade him welcome in a changed voice. "And now," said Mr. Utterson, as soon as Poole had left them, "you've heard the news?" The doctor shuddered. "They were crying it in the square," he said. "I heard them in my dining room." "One word," said the lawyer. "Carew was my client, but so are you, and I want to know what I am doing. You have not been mad enough to hide this fellow." "Utterson, I swear to God," cried the doctor, "I swear to God, I will never set eyes on him again. I bind my honour to you that I am done with him in this world. It is all at an end. And indeed, he does not want my help. You do not know him as I do. He is safe. He is quite safe. Mark my words. He will never more be heard of." The lawyer listened gloomily. He did not like his friend's feverish manner. "You seem pretty sure of him," said he, "and for your sake, I hope you may be right. If it came to a trial, your name might appear." This video is going to answer the following question. How does Stevenson create a tense atmosphere in this extract? You will notice that Stevenson begins this extract with a rather long description of Jekyll's laboratory. Now, most pupils probably think that this description is rather random. In their view, Stevenson describes the laboratory just because he feels like it. But that's not true. A writer never describes something for no reason. Everything that Stevenson writes has a purpose. Now, if you want to get above a grade 5, you therefore need to try to get in Stevenson's head. You need to ask yourself, what is Stevenson doing here? So what's the purpose of this long description of a laboratory? Well, here's my suggestion. Stevenson describes Jekyll's gloomy laboratory to establish an ominous atmosphere. Or, in other words, Stevenson describes Jekyll's gloomy laboratory to create a sense that something evil is happening in this building. Let's now look at our evidence for this idea. Stevenson describes Jekyll's laboratory as a dingy, windowless structure. Now, this word dingy means dirty. Jekyll's laboratory has been left to rot and decay for a long time. Now, it's also significant that this building is windowless. It's clear that Jekyll does not want the outside world to see inside this laboratory. Something is happening in this building that Jekyll wants to hide from the outside world. This building seems to hold some dark secrets. Together, these descriptions create a sense of sinister mystery around Jekyll's laboratory. Jekyll's laboratory also lies gaunt and silent. Now, when you describe a place as looking gaunt, you are suggesting that it looks grim and desolate. Stevenson is suggesting that this building is completely empty and abandoned. Now, the fact that the laboratory is silent further creates an eerie atmosphere. Stevenson is making one thing very clear. Jekyll has deserted his laboratory and quit his scientific research. Now, this raises another question. What has happened to make Jekyll abandon his experiments? Something awful must have occurred to make this passionate scientist give up his research. But Stevenson leaves this question unanswered. The floor of Jekyll's laboratory is strewn with crates and littered with packing straw. In other words, Jekyll's laboratory is in a shambolic state. It is messy and chaotic. There are crates everywhere, and the floor is covered in packing straw. It is evident that Jekyll has searched through these crates in a great hurry. But Stevenson does not reveal why. Once again, the author leaves his reader with more questions than answers. This sense of mystery is further reinforced by Stevenson's descriptions of the fog throughout Jekyll's property. He describes Jekyll's foggy cupola, and he describes how the fog lies thickly in Jekyll's house. Now, this is significant because in chapter 4, Stevenson established fog as a motif or symbol of evil. Let me explain. In chapter 4, fog appears at two different moments. It first of all appears on the night of Carewe's death. We get told a fog rolled over the city in the small hours. Fog, secondly, appears in Stevenson's description of the corrupt neighbourhood of Soho. He writes it was by this time about 9 in the morning, and the first fog of the season, a great chocolate-coloured pall lowered over heaven. What do you notice about these two descriptions? In both of these, you will see that Stevenson uses fog to create a sense of evil. In the first description, fog reinforces the sense that evil is invading a city on the night of Carewe's death. In the second description, the presence of fog in Soho reinforces the sense that Soho is a corrupt and evil place. Stevenson thus establishes fog as a motif or symbol of evil. So I would suggest that the presence of fog in Jekyll's property seems to suggest that something evil is at work in this character's life. Now, Stevenson is doing something very clever in these descriptions of Jekyll's laboratory. If you write well about this next idea, you would be well on your way to getting a top grade. It's clear that something very evil is at work in Jekyll's laboratory. But what is the nature of this evil? Well, many of Stevenson's readers would have believed that some dark, supernatural presence is at work in this place. Let me explain. Stevenson is using Gothic imagery in these descriptions of the foggy weather and the gloomy laboratory. Now, Gothic imagery comes from a Gothic genre. This genre was particularly popular in the late 18th century, about 100 years before Stevenson wrote this novel. Now, Gothic narratives often use gloomy descriptions and unpleasant weather, such as fog, to create a tense atmosphere. These narratives are filled with descriptions of gloomy castles, monasteries, and churches covered in mist and darkness. Now, here's the important thing. Gothic writers used this imagery to hint about the presence of a supernatural. They often described these gloomy settings to hint about some ghostly presence. Now, Stevenson's readers would have been very familiar with the conventions of the Gothic genre. When they read this description of Jekyll's gloomy laboratory and the foggy weather, they would therefore expect some sort of supernatural presence to be at work in this building. This expectation that an evil supernatural force is operating in Jekyll's life makes a twist at the end of our novel all the more shocking. In chapter 9, the reader discovers that there is no supernatural presence in Jekyll's life at all. The evil at work in this man's life does not come from a ghost or vampire or demon. Instead, the evil at work in Jekyll's life comes from Jekyll himself, in the form of Mr. Hyde. It is therefore fitting that Stevenson describes Jekyll's laboratory as such a gloomy and evil-looking place, because this is a building where Hyde was first created. And that brings us to the end of our first idea. Stevenson describes Jekyll's gloomy laboratory to establish an ominous atmosphere. Let's now go on to our second idea. Stevenson establishes a tense atmosphere through presenting Jekyll as inexplicably troubled. Dr. Jekyll is now looking deadly sick. Now, this moment is particularly shocking. It is clear that Jekyll's health has rapidly deteriorated. In chapter 3, Stevenson presented Jekyll as a healthy and handsome man. But now, his health has suddenly worsened, and he is now very sick. Jekyll must have experienced something terrible for such a sudden change in his health to take place. But, once again, Stevenson does not reveal this secret to the reader. He does not reveal why Jekyll has suddenly become so sick. It's only in chapter 10 that Stevenson reveals that Jekyll was sick with guilt after Carewe's murder. Jekyll is now tormented by shame over Hyde's crimes. He is a pale shadow of a handsome socialite introduced in chapter 3. Jekyll also does not rise to meet Utterson when he arrives. This seems like rather strange behaviour. As a polite and sociable gentleman, you would think that Jekyll would have the good manners to stand up and greet Utterson, but instead he remains in his armchair. It seems that Jekyll has suddenly become rather reclusive and aloof. Jekyll next holds out a cold hand towards Utterson and greets him in a changed voice. Now I want to zoom into this description of Jekyll's cold hand. There's two ways of interpreting this. Perhaps Jekyll's hand is physically cold because of his sickness. But I think Stevenson is also making a comment here about Jekyll's cold or frosty manner towards Utterson. Jekyll does not appear to be very friendly here. He does not seem to be very happy with Utterson arriving at his house. This reinforces our sense that Jekyll has become somewhat unsocial. All in all, Stevenson is contrasting the sickly, reclusive Jekyll of chapter 5 with the handsome dinner party host of chapter 3. Such a contrast suggests that Jekyll has suffered a terrible reversal of fortune. But once again, Stevenson does not reveal why Jekyll has changed. He raises more questions than answers. Let's now look at Jekyll's words to Utterson. When Utterson asks if Jekyll is protecting Hyde, the scientist replies, "Utterson, I swear to God," cried the doctor, "I swear to God, I will never set eyes on him again." Now, Jekyll does three things to try to demonstrate his innocence here. First of all, he appeals to God. Jekyll is claiming that his words are so true that he's prepared to swear to God himself. Secondly, Jekyll repeats this oath to God to further reinforce his sincerity. He says, "I swear to God," twice. And thirdly, Jekyll raises his voice and cries these words. Now, the reader is likely to find Jekyll's words unconvincing. In fact, they actually raise our suspicions. It seems that Jekyll is overly eager to defend his innocence. The reader is likely to assume that Jekyll will continue to pursue his strange relationship with Hyde. Our suspicions are likely to be raised by Jekyll's strange speech pattern. Read Jekyll's words here. Listen to the way that I must pause for every punctuation mark. It is all at an end. And indeed, he does not want my help. You do not know him as I do. He is safe. He is quite safe. Mark my words. He will never more be heard of. This broken speech pattern makes Jekyll seem hesitant. Perhaps he is worried about giving too much information away to Utterson. It also gives us a sense that Jekyll has a sort of nervous energy. To use Utterson's words, he seems feverish. Jekyll is clearly in a lot of anxiety and feels very uncomfortable discussing Hyde. So how does Stevenson want us to feel towards Jekyll? Well, I would suggest that we're supposed to feel three conflicting emotions for this character. On one hand, the reader pities Jekyll because he has clearly experienced a tragic reversal of fortune. At the same time, we also feel suspicious towards Jekyll because he is clearly withholding information about his relationship with Hyde. And thirdly, more than anything else, we share Utterson's curiosity to discover what is going on in Jekyll's life. Through leaving our questions unanswered, Stevenson's writing keeps us engaged. And that brings us to the end of our second idea. Stevenson establishes a tense atmosphere through presenting Jekyll as inexplicably troubled. Let's now read through the two main ideas of this video one last time. Number 1, Stevenson describes Jekyll's gloomy laboratory to establish an ominous atmosphere. And number 2, Stevenson establishes a tense atmosphere through presenting Jekyll as inexplicably troubled. I'll now give my final thoughts on this extract. This extract is a perfect example of Stevenson deliberately misleading his readers. The Gothic imagery in this extract creates a sense that something supernatural is taking place in Jekyll's life. And Jekyll's sickness and suspicious behaviour makes us believe that Hyde is still operating in his life. This dangerous criminal seems to represent a corrupting influence and dangerous threat to Jekyll. Stevenson creates these expectations to make the twist at the end of our novel all the more shocking. The evil at work in Jekyll's life does not come from the supernatural at all, but rather from within Jekyll, in the form of Mr. Hyde. And the idea that Hyde is a dangerous threat to Jekyll also turns out to be completely wrong. Hyde is simply a reflection of Jekyll's darkest desires. The greatest threat to Jekyll comes from his own evil nature. Through Jekyll's character, Stevenson thus presents a terrifying perspective on human nature. In this novel, evil is not some supernatural force that comes from the outside world, but rather a force that comes from within. To use Stephen King's words, monsters are real. They live inside us, and sometimes they win. And that brings us to the end of this lesson. If you would like to learn more about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, click the links to my other videos on this novel above. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. I will be releasing more videos on Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde across the coming weeks and months. But for now, all the best.